Hi there. Thank you for joining us. I'm Justin McNaughton. I'm an intellectual property attorney out of the Nashville office. And with me is Alan Paxton, a corporate attorney out of our Denver office. And today we are going to spend about 25, 30 minutes running through a long list of different considerations that people should be aware of as they're starting a company, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's a technology company, whether it's a photography business or an artificial intelligence company. We're going to kind of walk through these things, and at the end, we'll open it for question and answer. So if you have questions as we go along, please put them in the Q&A section down at the bottom of the screen, and then we will handle those at the end. So as we get started here, so Alan, I want to ask you just a couple of questions. What are some things that people should be thinking about in terms of just getting started? What are the first things that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Justin. I think one of the most important things to think about when you are starting your business is how to protect yourself and protect your business. And the name of the game there really is separation is protection. You want to make sure that your personal assets are separated from your business assets. And so one of the simplest ways that I think you can do that is by opening separate bank accounts for your business and your personal funds, keeping those separate, not commingling things. That's super important. But when you're doing that, it comes with creating your entity for your business. A lot of people are choosing LLCs as the entity type for their business. Other people are picking corporations. There are a lot of different factors that go into making that decision, from taxes to management style. It might lean you one way or the other. But at the end of the day, either entity type protects you from the liabilities of your business. The entity acts as a shield, and it keeps the liabilities of the business within the business. It doesn't creep into your personal assets, your personal funds, generally speaking. And so that's super important. And you want to avoid certain pitfalls of remixing your personal and your business, such as making personal guarantees for loans that the business might take on. I would be super averse to remixing what you're intentionally separating.
So if you can avoid it, you try to avoid those personal guarantees. Sometimes it won't be possible. Now, what about insurance? What are there certain companies that should have insurance and others shouldn't, or how does insurance work?
Yeah, definitely. Some of it depends on the type of industry you're in. You might be in an industry that requires you to get specific insurance, and that might dictate what kind of carrier you go to. But certainly, if you're a corporation, you might look at having directors and officers insurance, and there's a lot of carriers out there that do that as well. So there's sort of general business considerations that might dictate the insurance you get, but there's also those that might come up depending on what industry you might be involved with.
But all companies, in addition to forming
Right.
forming that corporate shell helps to protect you from liability, but insurance protects your company from going bankrupt in the event of a liability. So you definitely want both for all of those
Absolutely.
companies. So you mentioned what are some things that people should think about when they're considering whether to do a limited liability company, a corporation? Some people might do partnerships. What are some things that go into that?
Well, one of the largest distinctions between LLCs and corporations comes down to how they're taxed. And so in a corporation, the same dollar will be taxed twice. It'll be taxed as income to the corporation, and then it'll be taxed again if it's distributed out to the shareholders of the corporation. And the LLC avoids that. The LLC has just one layer of taxation and avoids the double taxation of corporations. So if you're in an LLC, it's just taxed once generally when it goes to the owner of the LLC. And so that's super attractive to a lot of people, that it generally tends to be more tax efficient to operate an LLC. That said, both entities enjoy the same level of protection for their owners. They shield you from the liabilities of the business. But another big consideration, in addition to taxes, that people think about is that some large investors do prefer corporations. And Justin, I'm sure you've seen that in with some of your clients.
Yeah, but we try to figure out which entity makes the most sense, because you can always come back,
Oh,
and we'll
absolutely.
talk a little bit about investors later, but if an investor doesn't like your form of entity, well, you just change it. And then it's not that uncommon. So you do want to, I think you want to try to find an entity that's practical and matches what you're doing today and in the next few years, and then adjust and plan. As long as you're being intentional about it, I think you can get to just about anywhere from just about anywhere. It's when you make mistakes or don't do things that it becomes difficult to correct. So
Absolutely. And we even have planned before, pick what's right for you now, but we've also put in some of our organizing documents for new companies, clauses that allow the company to change entity type down the road if that's something that they run into and find necessary. And so we can plan ahead for those sorts of things if we think there could be a change in the future.
And so give those rights to the manager so that it doesn't require the full vote of all the shareholder, or all the members, that kind of thing, if you're an LLC.
Exactly.
So, okay, so there are definitely ways to do that. Well, let's move to the next kind of topic, employees and independent contractors. So every startup is going to deal with these. I guess I'll just walk through a couple of things that I've seen, and you can add to that. So one of the things, I guess the hardest decision is always figuring out, okay, do I have employees or do I have independent contractors, and what should I have? And that is not a clear distinction. I'm certainly watching some of these Uber decisions, and if Uber doesn't have an independent contractor, then it makes you wonder, like, who does have independent contractors? But some of the things, regardless of that, it's important to have clear policies as you're bringing on people in your company, whether they're independent contractors or not. Have clear policies, like what they can and can't do, what's expected, build that culture, have confidentiality agreements. There's another type of agreement that we always recommend, which are proprietary rights agreements. And the concept there is that when you have somebody working on your company, if you're developing anything that might be protectable, whether it's content, whether it's an invention, whether it's photography, whether it's any kind of thing that you might want to control or that's new and being developed for you, then you want to make sure that everybody who's working for you is assigning that to your company. Now, some industries, this isn't as important. If you're in some services industries, it may not be as big a concern, but there are some where you will not get investment if you do not have these in place. And it kind of goes back to this employee versus contractor consideration, that the issue is that for intellectual property and for some other things, the rules completely change if you're an employee versus whether you're a contractor. So if you hire a bunch of contractors, the default is that they control and own everything that they're developing. And if you hire a bunch of employees, the default is that anything that's inside of the scope of their employment is owned by the company. So there are very big changes. And I see where it comes in, and maybe you can talk about this, but people tend to prefer to, I think people prefer to hire independent contractors because there's a perception that it saves them money. When in fact, it might, in some cases, it makes things a lot more complicated. To that. So for example, you might reduce your overhead having contractors because you're not doing withholding, you're not, you're not paying some of these taxes, that kind of thing. But if you're wrong, then you're looking at penalties, you're looking at possible claims. And so you just really want to look at this. And a lot of it goes to the control that you are exercising over people, right? Like if someone's truly a contractor, you have a written agreement with them, that's basically what your control over them is basically like, hey, we have this written agreement, you're going to do this and this. you let me know when it's done, send it to me or whatever. And an employee, you're managing every step of the way, right? It's on you to make sure it comes out right. And so you just got to be careful when you're doing that. You know, it's sometimes you save a few bucks, you call them a contractor, and later it costs you a lot more to sort things out because they should have been an employee. Um, I encourage, so having written agreements or at least policies with employees is super important, but with contractors, every contractor needs a written agreement. I mean, there's just very little, there are very few instances where I can think of that you wouldn't have a written agreement with a contractor. So let's switch over to some other things that businesses should do. What are some other things that you think that businesses should be doing when they're getting started? Like what are some other things they should be considering?
So I think something very important for all businesses to consider is the regulatory framework that they need to operate within and comply with. And I kind of think of that framework as having kind of two separate buckets. One of those being your sort of state and local regulations that apply to any business, kind of general business requirements. So if your city or county requires you to get a general business permit or license, if you're a sales-based business, getting a sales tax license, those might be sort of things that you have to get just by nature of doing business in a certain location, no matter what kind of business you're in. So that's kind of bucket one. Bucket two, I think about is specific to the industry that you're operating in. So I work with a lot of cannabis businesses, for example. And so in Colorado, we have local rules and regulations and state rules and regulations that every business has to comply with. We also have a licensing process, often at the state and local level, that you have to go through to even get involved in the industry. So looking at what kind of business you're doing, figuring out, is there industry specific rules? Are there industry specific licenses that I or my business need to get in place in order to operate? That is super important because you don't want to be operating without a license and getting fined and getting penalties or getting shut down. You want to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row from a regulatory perspective when you're getting started.
So you want to look at, so it sounds like you want to, I mean, you got to look at all these general ones. So rules that apply to, and regulations that apply for every business. So you got licenses that apply to everybody, but then you also want to go look, because typically it's in a totally different place. It might be a different regulatory agency for your particular industry. So if a restaurant will need a normal license from the city or county in most places, but then they'll also might need a liquor license, or they may need some other kind of license to do their entire business. So that makes sense.
Justin, you were talking a minute ago about protecting your IP with contractors and also protecting it with employees. I feel like there's some more stuff with intellectual property that businesses should be aware of.
So, and that's a lot to that question. Let's real quick before I answer that, let me let's just real quick run through the different types of intellectual property, and then I think that'll make it a little easier. But so you've got they're generally four categories. You've got patents, copyrights, trade secrets, and trademarks. And without spending a whole bunch of time, just because we don't have that much time today, essentially patents, I would say a minority of companies will have inventions and patents, and that's normal. It's just, of the companies that I see, a smaller percentage of them are eligible for that sort of thing. And you can tell if you need to be looking for a patent if you have developed some new thing, something that didn't exist before, and you feel like that's what's going to be your competitive advantage, or if you are working on some sort of technology or some kind of new thing where it's the thing itself that's giving you your competitive advantage. That's when you want to look at whether patent is available. And it's not the end of the analysis, but that's basically it, because you're trying to protect somebody from actually doing or creating the thing that you are creating. Most businesses are not competing on, like, take a uh, we were just talking about restaurants. A restaurant is competing on its name and its service, that sort of thing, not usually on some sort of technology advancement. So then you move to copyright. Copyright is while most startups will have a copyright, um, you really should look at protecting them when you're in certain industries where photography or software development or let me see some other, if you are like a content creator, if you're writing books or doing courses, those sorts of things, podcasting, where what you're actually creating is the value. So it's not that you're the only person who can take photographs. It's that your particular photographs are what create the value for your company. And when you have that, or your particular software, and you would lose value to your company if somebody else were to copy that, right? When you have a situation like that, then you want to start looking at copyright and registering those copyrights. It's not required, but it gives you a lot of extra advantages. And there are some benefits to registering it if you register before a problem comes along. So that's the second type. The third type is trade secret. And a trade secret, I think these are the underdogs of the intellectual property world. But trade secrets are anything that you have as a company or a person that creates value for your company or gives your company an advantage just because other people don't know it. And it can be anything. It can be a customer list. It can be a recipe. It can be a bunch of recipes. It can actually be software code itself. It can be the way that you do something if it's not easily discoverable by other people. So in trade secrets, the beauty of trade secrets is that it sounds kind of funny, but the only thing you have to do to protect them is keep them secret. And so, that includes, passwords on hard drives where you're keeping them, locking cabinets where you have that sort of thing. Making sure you're not giving them to, don't tell anybody. If you have to tell somebody, using confidentiality agreements. And so, but the idea there is that if you don't respect them, then nobody else will either, and you can't protect something that you're not actually keeping secret. So then the last one is trademark. Every company has a trademark, whether they know it or not. And what a trademark is really just the words or the symbol or the combination that a company is using, that when people see that, they know the origin of the goods and services. They remember, oh, I've seen this before. I've experienced that before. That is this particular, those goods and services come from this particular place. And so, so this becomes very important because as your company becomes better known, people will start to try to trade off of your name and try to siphon potential customers off of you. And so again, registering your trademark, the first step is clearing it, just making sure that nobody else out there is using the trademark, right? You do your diligence, or an attorney can help you, just to make sure you're not going to spend $100,000, launch into a company only to realize that was already a company, and then they come knocking on your door. And then the second step is to actually file and register that trademark. And they're same with copyrights. It's not required, but there are lots of benefits in terms of damages if somebody were to use your trademark, but also just in peace of mind. Like once you have it registered for 5 years, like nobody can challenge you anymore. So there are lots of benefits to doing this, but the idea is just to be very intentional with intellectual property, the same as you would be intentional with having a separate bank account for all of your transactions in and out of a company. You want to be very intentional with your intellectual property and protecting it. So, so I think back to your original question, once we've got that kind of framework, is I do think the most important thing is just being intentional. It's making sure that you spend some time and figure out what you do have. And then you can decide, okay, this particular thing is worth the money to protect, or is worth the money to do something else with, and this particular thing is not, and just being intentional about that as you move forward, so that you don't have any surprises. um, and like I said, registrations do provide additional benefits. So in most instances, it's worth just taking a look and see if you're eligible for, and whether those are available. So we've got, let's see here, we've got about five, maybe 5 to 10 more minutes before we do questions. Just got this last topic, and I'll fill this for you. And this is just kind of walk us through some of the typical ways that people fund startups, as they're first getting out. And it may be different, it's different at different stages of development, but just walk us through kind of what I just
Yeah.
started a business. I've got some of my own money in it. I'm running out of that, but what do I do next?
Yeah, well, a lot of people go to their friends and family and they say, hey, this is the new business I'm trying to start. Here's my project. Here's my idea. Here's my product. Do you want to buy in? Are you interested? And there are different ways that people buy in. Some friends and family might lend some money. Some might want a piece of the company. There's tons of different ways to do that, but most people do start by going to their friends and family. Is kind of the
So,
sort one.
and I have a story, and this is honest to goodness story. And this is kind of getting at, you tend to think of those friends and family investments as just informal, right? Like, it's just like, oh, it's dad, it's like whoever. And so that sometimes it happens very informally. And so I had a client years ago that it was your classic. I think there were 3, maybe 4 investors in this LLC. They got going. It was actually a pretty cool couple of, they had a couple different verticals they were in. It was a neat little business. And they, at one point, they borrowed money from one of the founders' father-in-law, lent them some money. They got going, did all. Then fast forward 4 or 5 years, and something happened. There's a falling out. One of the founders was actually sort of removed from the company. Um, so everything sort of changed overnight. And that same founder also had gotten divorced along the way. So all of a sudden, you had this situation where the remaining investors kind of reformed they kind of regrouped. They're going, they're basically digging through all the stuff and discover they've got this loan to a former founder's ex-father-in-law. And they don't know how much it is for. They don't know. They just know that they've been paying on it. And fortunately, that one worked out well, but it illustrates like how important it is to document these things, because I mean, I guarantee you it will happen. It may not happen to you, but it'll happen. And you'll be fortunate if it doesn't happen to you, of course. But it's so important that even if it's just a friend, that you're documenting these things. So, but walk us through some of these other ways that people bring in money or kind of capitalize their companies.
Yeah, definitely. And I would just echo your point, Justin, about documenting. Documentation is key at every stage of financing, especially with family and friends. When you have later stage investors coming in, they're going to want to see that you've papered all of the investments you've gotten, that there's not someone out there who's going to come around and say, I gave you $100,000, pay me back. They want to have a universal certainty. So I do echo that point. Besides friends and family, somewhere else, a lot of companies, well, maybe not a lot, but some companies turn to it in the early stages is crowdfunding. And that's kind of emerged in recent years with the development of online platforms like Kickstarter, where people can go on and fund a particular product through crowdfunding. And some companies have gone and actually funded more than just a product. They've funded their companies through crowdfunding. And so that's another avenue that some people have gone to do some early fundraising.
So how does that typically work?
Yeah, so when you do crowdfunding, it's often taking small amounts of money from a large number of people.
And so instead of raising money where people are buying a share of your company, usually that's buying, like, it's basically promising to buy whatever you're going to produce in the future. So you're actually buying a good or service that'll happen.
Right.
And these are fascinating. I've had a couple of clients that have really had just neat experiences and raised a lot of money on Kickstarter and some of the others. And one of the things that I have come to realize, though, is that a lot of people think of these crowdfunding ways as like, they think of them as like a cheap way or an easy way to raise money, or a way where you're just, you're able to go get this money, but you're not giving up equity, you're not giving up anything. And what I have seen is it's not necessarily cheaper to, it may be in the long run, but it's not necessarily cheaper to raise money crowdfunding, because where you're raising money, you're going to spend a lot of money on legal fees and maybe bankers and that sort of thing, helping you arrange all the different things. When you're doing crowdfunding, if you're going to have a successful, and when I mean successful, like something that's actually going to capitalize your company, you're going to be spending money on videographers, on marketers, on script writers, on all of these different things, and figuring out different ways to fund your product to where it gets to a certain stage where people will buy it. Because people won't just buy something that's completely hypothetical. They want to see that it's almost done. And so when people do crowdfunding, it can be a very expensive process, and you don't necessarily want to do crowdfunding unless you're sure that you can fund that thing, because there's nothing more embarrassing than not funding it. And so there's a lot to that. They look very organic and they look very, like, oh, neat, check this thing out, what these guys did. But there's a lot of planning and a lot of time and sweat and tears that go into launching those campaigns. So I love the model, and I think that there are some companies that it's perfect for, but I'd caution people against just thinking like, oh, we'll just run a Kickstarter campaign, because it's every bit as difficult as some of these other fundraising things. Another one I would just throw out is that people often overlook are just like grants and loans. Small business loans or small business grants, if depending on your industry, can be a great way to get a company started. And sometimes they're really good terms. And sometimes they're better terms than you'll get from, your uncle. So looking into those, and again, these are things that they can be difficult. It can be a lot of paperwork, but I've had several friends do really well. And part of it is because when you do an SBA loan, the bank will kind of act as your go behind to make sure that you're doing all the things you're supposed to be doing. And so it serves as a corrective function, that if you can get through the process and get that loan, you've also done everything that you're supposed to do along the way. So sometimes those types of loans can be a really good option. So let's say, so you've got your initial funding, it looks like you've got a viable product, but your revenue still isn't quite there. What do you do next?
Well, sometimes you might be able to get an angel investor to come in and give you a cash influx. And so these are typically high net worth individuals that come in and invest in companies that have, started operating. Maybe they've raised some money from friends and family, but they're looking for additional investment, but they're not quite to the stage of going to large institutional investors, venture capital firms to get money. These high net worth individuals, these angel investors, will come in and they'll invest some money into the company. And that is something that we see sometimes.
So, and I was kind of laughing a little bit because I just sort of wonder, it feels like angel investors might have named themselves as opposed to the company. Because a lot of times this is really expensive money. When you look at Shark Tank and some of these others, like the angel investors expect a lot of return, and they know that things are a lot of these companies will fail or won't do well, and so they take a lot. So you have to be ready for that. And but sometimes there's no choice. Sometimes if you want to scale, you gotta have somebody help you do that. And I think that raises another interesting topic, which is whenever you're taking on money, I don't think it should just be for the money. Like there should be some other reason that you're taking that money. It should be that this person is an investor, but is also really adept in a particular field, or can connect you into something, or can add something other than just write a check. It seems like successful businesses can usually find people to write a check, but what they really need are people can help them do what they don't know how to do. And so, and I know that that's easier said than done in the moment when companies start to get a little desperate, when they're looking for bridge loans or looking for bridge financing, that kind of thing in between steps. But so you've got your angel investors. Hopefully your angel investors are helping you do what? Like what's the next step there?
Well, another value add that an angel investor might have is being able to introduce you to some institutional money. Maybe they know some people that were working at venture capital funds, and then you can get connected with these VC groups and that stage of financing, whether it's a Series Seed or Series A, moving on from your angel investment, your friends and family. These VC funds can come in and invest. They typically invest much more than just, your angel investors and your friends and family, but with some strings attached. They often will want to see, a board seat potentially. They want to have some control and management to some extent, but that is kind of the next stage of financing, is kind of the institutional money.
And so at that stage, that particular company that's coming in is going to probably, in a lot of cases, they will restructure your company. They will really start to, if you started off as one entity, hopefully over time, it's not usually that somebody accidentally gets venture capital funding. So usually if you're intentional about it, you're heading towards that and making changes. And then when you do finally get that venture capital funding, they'll have certain demands or polite requests, however you want to phrase that, where they will reshape some things and get it to their liking. And then at that point, that they will help you. The whole idea is to help you usually to an exit, usually to some sort of exit. So I think we'll take some questions. Before that, I just want to run through real quick kind of what we talked about. So, first things to keep in mind, or as you're starting a new company, you want to separate your personal life from your business life, and you want to put some formalities to this new venture, so that can be getting a corporate entity, getting some insurance. Then you're going to, from there, you're going to make sure you've got all your agreements in place, and always have a written agreement with everyone is the best rule. Start being intentional about whether you're bringing on employees and independent contractors, and making sure that you're, really thinking about that. You're not just like, oh, and years later discover that you never thought about what that should be. Then you're going to look at your regulations, general, as well as your anything industry specific. Then you're going to look at IP and figure out what you have, and then figure out what you're going to register and when you're going to register it. And then you're going to start looking at different funding options and being intentional about that process. So with that kind of summary, we've got some questions here, and I'll open it up. So the first one is, so on the IP front, is it always necessary to trademark your business name? So that question, that's actually a bit of a trick question. The way the trademarks typically work is that when you start using a name, you start developing rights in it. So you always have a trademark when you start using it. The questions that come up are whether somebody else has more rights in that name, and whether you can and do register it. So you, before you start using it, you want to make sure nobody else has it. And then when you start using it, you're going to get rights in it. And the best way to protect it is to register it. So, and this applies to anybody who, most businesses that are successful, it's worth looking at a trademark registration. The rights that, the benefits that it provides usually outweigh the costs of it. And it's something that you just have for as long as you have your business as well. Let's see here. The next one here, Alan, maybe you can field this one. It just says, how much of my initial budget should be designated for marketing? And I don't know that I know the answer to that, but
Yeah,
Alan, what are your thoughts on that?
that's a very good question. I don't know if I have a very specific answer on that either.
So that, one way to look at that, depending on what industry you're in, one way you could find that out though would be if you're in a go back to the easy one. I don't mean to say easy in terms of running the business, but an easy example is a restaurant. You can look up. So in California, there is a registry where all franchises have to register their documents. You might be able to look up the closest type of restaurant that is a franchise through California's database. Take a look at those franchise documents, and inside of them, it'll require people to disclose what they have to spend on that franchise on marketing. And then maybe once you've done that, look through that, see what those companies are spending, and that may give you a good, at least starting point for that. Let's see here. The next question, Alan, says, what is one of the most, we can each provide one of these, but what is one of the most common mistakes you see entrepreneurs make?
One of the most common mistakes I see entrepreneurs make is making agreements and deals and never putting them down on paper, whether it's a handshake deal or just something that you agree to orally. Eventually, if your company is being successful, you're going to have to get it down on paper at some point. And it is much harder to do so a year or two after you've agreed to it than if you just do it in the moment. In the short run, it might be cheaper to not have to incur legal fees to get something put down on paper. But in the long run, it's going to take us twice as long to go back and figure out who said what and what was actually agreed to. And oftentimes I've seen people don't have the same understanding about what was agreed to. So getting that done at the beginning of, a new relationship or setting up your business and getting things papered is very important. It protects you from potential disputes. It gives investors comfort. And I would just say that is definitely one of the biggest mistakes I see.
Yeah, and one of the biggest mistakes that I see from an intellectual property standpoint is, again, not having written agreements with independent contractors. So what'll happen is, say I have a software company, or we'll just use a software company. I have a software company. I've got 5 people in wherever writing code for me, and they're all independent contractors. They're not employees. They develop all of my code for me. And then I go to do whatever the next stage of my business is, and they find out they don't own any of that code because it was developed by all of these independent contractors, and some of them they don't still have contact with. And so then you're looking at, okay, what do we do? Do we replace that code? Sometimes if somebody makes a claim, and it creates a mess. So having a written agreement, and in that instance, specifically assigning to the company the intellectual property and or the software that's being developed is super, super important. And that's not easily fixed sometimes. Another question we have here is, do you still see people willing to work for sweat equity?
Absolutely. I'm sure you see it too, Justin, but I do see people that are parts of companies that might not contribute capital, but get ownership in the company in exchange for services. There are some really important tax considerations that come into play for sweat equity. And so you definitely want to make sure that you talk to an attorney and figure that out up front. That is one of the issues, particularly when you're getting sweat equity. That is something you want to consider on day one and not year 2, because the tax implications, especially if the company is successful, can be pretty significant the longer you wait to address that with your sweat equity owners.
Yeah, like the easy example is if you create an LLC, you have two people and one person puts in $200,000 and the other person is putting in time, just their sweat equity on. When you go to file your taxes, what you've just done is you've just paid the other guy $100,000. And so then the other guy is going to get taxed on $100,000 of income unless you're structuring it properly. So there are real reasons to really be conscientious about how you're dealing with sweat equity. But absolutely, I mean, sometimes the folks who are funding it don't know anything about the business, and the folks that know everything about the business don't have the money to start it. So you're always going to have these teams. But I think that's a great question, great thing to be thinking about. We've just got another minute or so here. Another question we have here is, do you always need an attorney to register trademarks and copyrights? The answer is absolutely no. You can register those things on yourself. There are tutorials on the copyright and the trademark office website. I will caution you to be very careful about that and really be sure that you understand what you're doing before you do it. I've run into lots of situations where it just costs way more later to fix it, and sometimes it can't be fixed than it would have been just to hire somebody to do it up front. So just make sure that you're really, really, really educating yourself if you're going to do that on your own, and then consider whether the even if it seems like it's a lot to hire an attorney for those things, typically you don't have to, it's back to our independent contractor versus employee, right? Your attorneys are going to be independent contractors. You don't have to spend buy all of their time. You just have to buy enough to get that project done. And usually it'll save you a lot of headaches down the road. So with that, Alan, any other parting words, or we'll go ahead and we'll wrap it up?
Nope, I think we're good to wrap up.
Okay. Well, again, we thank you. I'm Justin McNaughton out of the Nashville office, and Alan Paxton out of the Denver office, and just appreciate your time and being with us and talking through some of these issues. Wish you all a wonderful day.